Everybody, Brandon Williams here with again with Human Factors Leadership. Today, I'd like to talk briefly about, you probably heard about it in the news, but the preliminary report from the Air India 171 flight taking off out of Ahmedabad, India on June 12th, which unfortunately, as you probably know, crashed just shortly after takeoff. 229 passengers, 12 crew, and 19 people on the ground perished in that. And miraculously, there was one survivor on the aircraft. But this preliminary report just came out about 3 days ago. There's been a lot of talk out there. A lot of people, I think, making a lot of assumptions, which is always bad. And people just throwing stuff out there, I think, sometimes. But either way, it's definitely brought up a lot of discussion around this, and mainly around one of the key findings that they talk about in the report, which we're going to talk about here in a second. But real quick, first of all, what is that? Whenever there is an aircraft accident, the investigators of that nation or country, in this case, the Aircraft Aviation Accident Investigation Board there in India, assisted by FAA to send someone. Other countries that had passengers of nationalities on that aircraft would typically send someone. And then you have technical people from the manufacturer, in this case, Boeing, which will typically be involved. But basically, the country of that carrier will typically, or where that accident happened, will typically be the lead investigation in this case. But what comes out of this preliminary report, the purpose of that, number one, is just that defined to let you know, let the public know, let regulators and the industry know initial findings and essentially the direction of that investigation from what they found on that. It also serves to put out any immediate things that need to get out there for safety. So if there's any, design flaws, operating flaws, or anything that any operator or airline or maintenance or anyone that operates that aircraft would need to know about, that needs to get out right now in the interest of aviation safety. In this case, there's been no recommendations under that umbrella. And essentially anything that anyone that operates the 787, 800, the aircraft in this, that we need to do. But out of this preliminary report, there's been some interesting findings, which is kind of what everybody is talking about. So, so far what we know from this report is that the essentially the pre-flight taxi out, up to takeoff essentially was normal. What we know from the preliminary report, based on what they found from the flight data recorder, is about 3 seconds after liftoff, the number one and number two, the left and right engine fuel cutoff switches or fuel switches were put to cutoff from run to cutoff. And so these are two switches just below the throttle handles on the in the throttle quadrant, if you will, of that aircraft, which when those are flipped on, essentially starts the engine start sequence and will start fuel flow to those engines. That's a simplified way, but essentially that's what that is. And obviously, when those are cut off, what does that do? That shuts off fuel flow to those motors, those engines, which is, when an engine is going to shut down. So these were at some point, according to the flight data recorder, 3 seconds after takeoff, both shut down essentially within 1 second of each other, according to the preliminary report and what they found in the flight data recorder. So the first thing is going to be what they're going to look at is why. Okay, again, going back to human factors and what we're going to get out of this, as you if you think about this process is why was that decision made? Why was that decision made if one of the pilots did shut those off? Why was that decision made? The other thing will be looked at is if there was some way those could come off um, by themselves. Now, having flown, obviously airliners in my career and other airplanes, um, trying to understand how that would happen, I just extremely low chance of those switches just coming off by themselves. I'm not sure. There's had been instances of switches that were not designed well and wouldn't catch well, but in this case, especially this aircraft, that just don't see that at all. But again, we just don't know. The other question is if it was shut off by a pilot, then why? Was there some malfunction? Was there something they saw that would require both shutdown of the engines, whichever pilot did do that, if they did that for a reason? I try to think in that regime so low to the ground, just a few hundred feet, essentially right after liftoff, why would there be reason to shut both engines down with those fuel cutoff switches? And, I try to think about this and barring, a dual engine failure, which again, very unlikely. But barring that, I just don't see a reason why. But again, we just don't know. We don't know until they do more in the investigation, dig more into the flight data recorder, more investigation of the engine, the fuel system, everything else on this aircraft. Will we know more about that potentially? But that's going to be a big, big piece of this is the why behind that and that human factor decision if there was one there. Um, Other piece is 3 seconds, it was shut, those switches were shut off. And then soon after that, they said on the flight data recorder that one of the pilots said to the other, "Hey, why did you do that?" Again, we don't know which one said that. The other one said, "I didn't." Or, "Why did you shut off the fuel switches?" He said, "I didn't." And about 10 seconds after the fuel switches were shut off, the number one engine, the left engine switch, was turned back on. And then 4 seconds after that one, the number two switch was flipped back on. And so that's going to be the other question is why 10 seconds from when they were turned off, turned back on? Again, did they know they were off? Did the other pilot know they were turned off? Again, there's going to be a lot of obviously startle factor. There's going to be a lot of confusion, but that's going to be looked at. But again, human factors. What were the human factors at play? What was going on there? Um, and then again, 4 seconds later, the number two. So why not one and then two? You're so low to the ground. You're so low on thrust. Why are those not turned back on? So that's all going to be looked at as well. But that is clearly the most critical piece that we know so far. Now, as we go along, they're going to look at do more investigation on the engines itself, the actual physical engines, as well as the flight data recorder, which is going to tell all the parameters of those motors, those engines, how they were working, how the fuel system was going, electrical stuff, anything on the airplane that goes to that flight data recorder, they're going to look at in great detail. They'll continue looking at, things like pilot records and any other, all the maintenance history on the aircraft. Anything that was ever done to that airplane, they're going to look at in depth and see what happened. But at the end of the day, there will be human factors that come back to this, whether it's pilot decision making, whether it's design flaws. Because again, at some point, a human has been in that designing that piece of equipment. So it'll be look whether it was a mechanical issue, was there coming a maintenance issue that wasn't done correctly? That's going to be looked at. Again, why were these decisions made? At some point in that chain, there were decisions that made that led to this incident. And so that's what these accidents are all about is you look at all the truth data, as we call it. So that flight data recorder, the actual working parts of the aircraft, what was actually going on. Then you look at what was actually done, the decisions that were actually made. Then you want to get to those whys, those deep level whys. Contributing factors are going to be at play, but at the end of the day, you want to fly that deep level causal factor that eventually, unfortunately, resulted um, in this accident. So again, a lot to keep looking at here, but I just wanted to talk about that because I think it's critical to understand you know, when we look at this, it clearly was there's a human decision in there somewhere. A lot of people talking about things, a lot of people making assumptions, but again, we still don't know. But it is a very, very important finding that came out of this preliminary report, which will be interesting to see. Either way, it will come back to a human factor. We'll come back to a human decision, and that's why human factors is so important whether it's in your business, your personal life. That's why, human factors is so critical because anything that happens, whether it's, negative, positive, always goes back to human factors, whether it's task overload, complacency, fatigue, both mental and physical, lack of awareness, lack of communication, lack of understanding, loss of situational awareness, startle factor, like I talked about earlier. Everything goes into play and that affects how we make decisions. So that's why it's so critical for leaders to understand that and then help their people mitigate that. So we'll keep watching. Hey, everybody, thanks for watching this. Look forward to talking to you more and see you.